Hello and welcome to EULAR TV at EULAR 2025 Congress here in beautiful Barcelona. I am Maria Sokolova. I am a medical doctor at the University Hospital Schleswig-Holstein in Kiel, Germany, and it's my great pleasure to interview today Professor Karen Costenbader. She is a chair of clinical rheumatology at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, and a professor at Harvard Medical School. So, Professor Costenbader, thank you very much for joining us, for finding time at this very busy Congress. And we are meeting now right outside the session hall where the session was about nutrition, microbiome, and immune system. And Professor Costenbader just gave a very insightful and very important talk on the prevention of rheumatic diseases. And you're also an epidemiologist, so you work with huge data sets, and I will try to ask you a couple of questions because you're an expert and everybody wants to know a couple of things. So the first one would be, what are the most important environmental factors that we should consider when we think about preventing autoimmunity or that can trigger autoimmunity?
Thank you for the introduction, and that's a very large question. I think that I've been studying potentially modifiable environmental factors and the risk of rheumatic diseases, especially rheumatoid arthritis and systemic lupus, for most of my career. And so I can tell you the strongest ones are smoking for many autoimmune rheumatic diseases, for lupus and RA, and for others. Cigarette smoking is a classic risk factor, increases the risk of autoantibody positive disease, and probably makes the disease worse. So definitely bad for cutaneous lupus, etc., and diseases. So smoking, and then other inhaled exposures similar to smoking. So other environmental air pollution we know of, and then there's crystalline silica and uranium in the environment. So particles in the environment. Those have been shown to similarly. Probably for rheumatoid arthritis, there are models of how they stimulate the production of ACPA antibodies at mucosal surfaces, but also are related to rheumatoid arthritis. And for crystalline silica, it's really a T-cell adjuvant related to a lot of different autoimmune diseases. So a lot of the airborne exposures, those are strong ones and modifiable. And then today I was talking about nutrition and possibly what we eat. Our diet is modifiable and is related potentially through the microbiome. That was the rest of the session were fascinating talks on the microbiome and how it may be stimulating inflammation as well and triggering at least the innate, if not the adaptive immune system. So we've studied most recently ultra-processed food, and ultra-processed food is really junk food and it has very little resemblance to real food.
Yeah.
And there are many different mechanisms by which it could be related to the risk of disease, but it is related to risk of developing lupus and autoantibody positive lupus as well. So on the flip side, we've seen that Mediterranean diets and something called the empirical inflammatory diet, so other things that are related to decreased risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis with healthy diet and then avoiding the ultra-processed food. We know that body mass index, apart from diet, obesity is associated with our diseases. Mm-hmm. And so if you ask me the top 3 most modifiable and strongest risk factors, I would have to say it's the airborne exposures, smoking, air pollution, silica, etc., and then diet and obesity. There are others, but I won't go into all of them.
Yeah, that's a very broad topic. Are there any biomarkers that are emerging or metabolic targets that are emerging that we can use to maybe predict the disease onset in some autoinflammatory diseases?
That is a great question for autoimmune disease. I think it's really still now in the research stage. We did do a large study in the Nurses' Health Study based in Boston with nurses across the United States who gave blood samples, and then we all had dietary information and their risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis, and we did metabolomics on those, and we did see that there were signatures of carnitines and azocarnitines, so inflammatory fatty acids that were seen in the blood years prior to the development of rheumatoid arthritis, and they're not ready for prime time. We don't use them in the clinic, but it probably points to pathways. We know that that saturated fats are inflammatory and lead to inflammatory states in the body. So possibly through diet and the link with the carnitines in the blood as well. I think it's all fascinating. We don't yet have new biomarkers we're using in the clinic. That's the next phase is the implementation. But there were signatures they were talking about in the microbiome in the stool. And there are signatures in the blood, too, of inflammation in terms of other adaptive and innate immune cell immunoprofiling. We have T cell. Okay, I'm going on a tangent here. You're going to have to cut me off. There's a lot more. It's a very long topic. So I'll leave it there. But there are very interesting studies going on of biomarkers and changes in immune cell phenotypes prior to the onset of disease. They're not yet ready for clinical use.
Yeah, but that sounds very promising. We're looking forward. I have one last question for you, and it's about the data sets. In your expert opinion, what are the best ways to work with these big data sets to identify the emerging potentially new targets and biomarkers?
That's a good question, too. So I've been very fortunate to work with the Nurses' Health Study cohorts based in Boston for many years. They were started back in 1976, and I think we've almost exhausted everything we could study in terms of many different types of risk factors for developing rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And then I also work with the Black Women's Health Study, and there are other such cohorts based in Europe and around the world. I think that given that our diseases are relatively rare, we are fortunate to find big studies, trials, and cohorts that are already collecting these data, really good data, and then our job is to validate the outcomes, to make sure we know exactly when the disease of interest developed and have as much information as possible. So there are cohorts that are exposed to all kinds of things that are followed maybe for cancer or cardiovascular disease or in trials, but we need to know about our diseases to make sure they didn't exist at the beginning and when they did have onset, and then we can look back and see whether people had different types of exposures, lots of different exposures that can be studied. But it's a lot of work to make sure that the data sets are ready for our analyses.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you very, very much for finding time to talk to us and to our audience at EULAR TV. And see you next time.
Thank you for having me.